Georgetown University and a JD from Boston College Law School. Welcome, Mr. Boroya. Natasha Reed is a partner at Foley Hoag LLP and serves as the co-chair of the firm's trademark, copyright, and unfair competition practice. At the firm, Ms. Reed's practice covers all aspects of trademark and copyright law with a focus on global brand protection. Ms. Reed specializes in intellectual property enforcement and anti-counterfeiting and anti-piracy litigation, and is the co-editor of Foley Hoag's Trademark and Copyright Law blog. She earned her BA from Amherst College and her JD from Pepperdine University. Welcome, Ms. Reed. Before we proceed with testimony, I hereby remind the witnesses that all of your written and oral statements made to the subcommittee in connection with this hearing are subject to penalties of perjury pursuant to 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. Please note that your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. There is a timer in Zoom to help you stay within that time limit. And Ms. Kamel, you may begin, and I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly. Kamel, is it not?
It's Camel, but that's okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And sorry.
No problem. Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Issa, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak on the problem of the sale of counterfeit goods by third-party sellers on online marketplaces in the Shop Safe Act. My name is Carrie Camel. I'm the Assistant Director for Education and Outreach at the Center for Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection, or the ACAP Center at Michigan State University, and an adjunct professor of law at MSU College of Law. My remarks draw on our research on online trademark counterfeiting, as well as my work with brand protection industry professionals. At the ACAP Center, I and my colleagues focus on research, education, and outreach around trademark counterfeiting and brand protection. We work both with intellectual property rights owners and governments, as well as online marketplaces, social media platforms, and other industry experts across the field, giving us the unique ability to examine this significant problem holistically from a neutral academic perspective. Today, I'll give an overview of online counterfeit sales by third-party sellers and the current state of secondary liability and make 2 recommendations. One, I support the Shop Safe Act, and I have some recommendations that could be considered as the bill moves forward. And 2, I recommend continued collaboration, data sharing, and the funding and expansion of research on the trade in counterfeit goods and anti-counterfeiting responses. I would like to start by painting a picture of what is occurring in online marketplaces and the legal landscape for secondary liability for trademark counterfeiting. Counterfeit goods impact national economies as well as companies of all sizes. The sale of goods in online marketplaces, both authentic and counterfeit, has exploded in the past decade. The financial impact is staggering. Counterfeit goods have been estimated to have displaced roughly over $500 billion worth of global sales in 2016. And the onset of COVID-19 has led to increased online shopping as well as a risk of purchasing counterfeits. Counterfeiters' success by using other companies or brand owners' trademark on a product or package and rely on their reputation without authorization and sell a fake and usually substandard or even dangerous good. They also take advantage of the opportunity online marketplaces provide and rely on brands' goodwill and products to reach often unwitting consumers who cannot examine the goods before purchase, which is dealt with by online marketplaces in varying ways. In order for a counterfeit to be sold to a consumer on an e-commerce platform, there must be a meeting in time and space between 1, the consumer, 2, the counterfeiter's posting, and 3, the e-commerce platform. While reactive removal of the postings after they are listed is still necessary, it also means that the posting has already reached consumers. The most effective way to disrupt this is to remove one of these factors from the situation proactively before they ever reach that meeting at the same time and place on the platform. This can be done through a variety of activities that could include the e-commerce platform protecting the e-commerce selling space to keep counterfeit postings out, to protecting and educating consumers, as well as many more. However, the current state of the law rests primarily on the 2010 Second Circuit case of Tiffany versus eBay. This created the current legal standard, which is that an e-commerce platform only is required to react after a posting is already live, and they have specific knowledge from a brand as to which listing is infringing or will infringe in the future, known as the contemporary knowledge requirement. This is problematic as there is no legal obligation on an e-commerce platform to do anything to prevent counterfeits from being listed or to monitor their own platforms for counterfeit, even though they are in the best position to do so, and have the most control over that space and time of where the consumer and counterfeiter meet on their platform. The Shop Safe Act helps to protect consumers and brands by requiring activities for e-commerce platforms to undertake to disrupt the meeting of consumers and counterfeiters on their platform, and has some strengths and some opportunities to improve the language, which I note in my written testimony. Two of the top strengths of the Act are: one, requiring e-commerce platforms to implement at no cost to the registrant reasonable proactive technological measures for screening goods, and two, requiring the conspicuous display of each listing the country of origin and manufacture of the goods and the identity and location of the seller. Three of my suggestions for consideration are: one, to remove the limit on protection only to goods that implicate health and safety, so as to not create a two-class system of counterfeit marks. And if it is not removed, to clarify the provision to include any good, counterfeit or genuine, that would implicate health and safety. Two, edit the language to include proactive measures, including technology, but not limit it to only technological measures. And three, add a requirement for e-commerce platforms to have a clear, easy access mechanism for consumers to report suspected counterfeit. I also recommend continued and expanded collaborations regarding data sharing between marketplaces, brands, the IPR Center, and academia, and to expand research on the trade in counterfeit goods and anti-counterfeiting responses. Property rights holders and US consumers, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Camel. Next, we will hear from Ms. Simpson for 5 minutes. The floor is yours, Ms. Simpson.
Chairman Nadler, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Issa, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Personal Care Products Council on our support for the Shop Safe Act and the subcommittee's efforts to address the critical and growing risk of online sales of counterfeit products, including cosmetics and personal care products. My name is Meredith Simpson. I'm Vice President, Federal Government Affairs for the Personal Care Products Council, the leading national trade association representing global cosmetics and personal care products companies. E-commerce platforms create valuable opportunities for legitimate companies to grow, reach new consumers, and provide buyers with numerous choices and convenience. However, the current structure is vulnerable to exploitation and contributes significantly to a rise in illegal trade. Global trade in counterfeit and pirated goods is expected to reach $991 billion by next year. Counterfeit products are fraud. They damage businesses, are a drain on the economy, and most importantly, threaten consumers' health and safety. Our member companies are committed to product safety, quality, and innovation. The average consumer uses 12 personal care products each day and trusts the makers of those products to supply them and their families with safe and high-quality products. The U.S. cosmetics industry invests nearly $3 billion each year in scientific research and development to evaluate and ensure the safety of their products before they reach the consumer. The cosmetics industry loses more money to counterfeit products each year than any other industry, with annual losses of approximately $5.4 billion to fraudulent sellers. One of our member companies reports that all of their 30 brands have been counterfeited, everything from nail polish to fragrance to shampoo to eyeshadow. Counterfeit products pose health risks to consumers since they are produced illegally without adherence to federal or state safety and quality requirements. Counterfeit cosmetics can be tampered with, expired, and contain materials not of cosmetic grade, meaning consumers may be applying adulterated or impure ingredients directly to the skin, lips, eyes, and other sensitive areas, including products indicated for children's use. In a January 2020 report, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security noted that counterfeit cosmetics can often contain elements such as arsenic, mercury, and aluminum, and have been found to be contaminated with substances from harmful bacteria to human waste. Consumers are at a risk of purchasing a dangerous counterfeit product because they can't tell the difference between an authentic and counterfeit product when shopping online, as sellers will often use brand owners' own product images and trademarks in online offers. The burden of enforcing against counterfeit goods on online platforms falls on the makers of the authentic products rather than the platforms. A single personal care products company may spend as much as $15 million annually to fight counterfeits, including monitoring and the platforms and social media sites, enforcing against counterfeits through notice and takedown processes, test buys and lab testing of purchases, and working and sharing information with competitors and federal, state, and local law enforcement, including training to better detect counterfeits. Many smaller companies lack the necessary resources to tackle online counterfeits. While we applaud some platforms' efforts to address counterfeits in recent years, many do not have any proactive measures in place, and the ones that do are often not transparent about their counterfeit prevention policies and processes, and there's a lack of standardization. Brand owners continue to have significant difficulty accessing verified information on sellers that have been known counterfeiters from the platforms. For example, one of our member companies employs 10 external firms to manage their online platform notice and takedown processes. Another brand has seen notice and takedowns more than double over the last year. Despite the personal care products industry's aggressive efforts to mitigate the harms of counterfeit goods through direct engagement with the platforms, too often our members cannot keep up with the sheer number of counterfeit listings, are hindered by a lack of cooperation from the platforms and by the difficulty in identifying sellers who can too easily hide and change their information. All the while, consumers are put at risk from these potentially dangerous products. PCPC strongly supports the Shop Safe Act's establishment of a framework to advance best practices for online platforms, incentivize platforms to address the sale of counterfeits on their channels, and help ensure that products sold online are safe, authentic, and comply with U.S. laws and regulations, and most importantly, protect unsuspecting consumers from unsafe products. We look forward to working with this committee and other stakeholders to advance the Shop Safe Act. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Simpson. And now we will proceed to Mr. Baroya. Mr. Baroya, you may begin.
Subcommittee Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Issa, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Shop Safe Act. My name is Jonathan Baroya, and I'm the Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Internet Association. IA represents over 40 of the world's leading internet companies and is the only trade association that exclusively represents leading global internet companies on matters of public policy. We can all agree that protecting consumers from harmful counterfeit products, no matter how they enter the supply chain, is an important priority. While a small percentage of online sellers are bad actors who use the internet to market and sell counterfeit goods, internet companies, including IA members, have been working with trademark owners and law enforcement officials to protect consumers from counterfeits for many years. But because professional counterfeiters are incredibly resourceful and adept at circumventing enforcement activities, it is also critical to examine and understand the unintended consequences of proposed solutions. Ultimately, the experiences of IA's members demonstrate that online marketplaces are adequately incentivized to collaborate with brands to fight counterfeiting, and that existing trademark doctrine strikes the right balance between protecting consumers and brand owners from counterfeit goods, while also allowing the online economy to thrive. While mass-scale counterfeiting obviously did not begin with the internet, the complexity of the modern supply chain makes trademark enforcement incredibly challenging, and all stakeholders have important and complementary roles to play in the fight to protect consumers from harmful counterfeit goods. Trademark holders possess unique knowledge that is essential to determining whether an item is counterfeit or genuine. Retailers and online platforms must use that information to identify counterfeit goods and prevent them from entering or remaining in the stream of commerce. And law enforcement officers must have reliable leads from brands, retailers, and online platforms in order to investigate counterfeiting operations and bring manufacturers of illegal products to justice. If any of these stakeholders are unable to fulfill their roles, the consequences can be dire. Internet companies understand this fact and have every incentive to support IP enforcement activities because their businesses depend on consumer and brand trust in order to succeed. The law does not shield online services from liability when they know that a particular listing is infringing or where a service is willfully blind to infringing listings. But trust is an even more compelling business reason for online services to collaborate with brands and protect their customers from counterfeit goods. To put it plainly, customers who are duped into purchasing fake goods through a particular service will vote with their dollars and shop elsewhere, and trademark owners will refrain from entering into partnerships with services that fail to take counterfeiting seriously. IA members have demonstrated their commitment to protecting consumers from counterfeit goods in several ways, including by investing millions of dollars each year to stem the flow of counterfeits on their platforms, and by going far beyond what the law requires to collaborate with brand owners and other stakeholders. IA member companies have taken the lead by implementing clear anti-counterfeiting policies and by proactively creating transparent and innovative counterfeit reporting prevention tools that allow third parties to identify counterfeit items listed for sale and remove them in a timely manner. IA members have also developed close relationships with law enforcement agencies to combat counterfeit goods, like U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the National Intellectual Property Rights Center, as well as other federal and state enforcement agencies. Online services regularly report misconduct to law enforcement agencies, and several have proactively created training programs to ensure that law enforcement officers understand how their services work and are aware of evolving online infringement and investigative techniques. Despite the fact that major online platforms already work closely and productively with brand owners and law enforcement officials, the Shop Safe Act would drastically change the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders. For example, the bill would replace trademark holders' actual expertise and judgment in differentiating between legitimate products and fakes with a vague reasonable awareness standard that platforms would have to apply in the absence of any specific knowledge about the underlying trademark goods. Rather than keep these judgment calls in the hands of the IP owners who have this expertise, Shop Safe would effectively push platforms to toss the baby with the bathwater by removing millions of listings posted by sellers who are making permissible use of trademarks in an effort to eradicate a small minority of listings posted by bad actors who will not easily be deterred in their efforts to circumvent detection. The bill would also require platforms to verify the identity of every single third-party seller, presumably using government identification that the platforms are not in a position to physically inspect or properly verify. They would also be required to investigate and periodically confirm the physical address of each seller or their US-based registered agent to determine that the address exists and presumably its nexus to the seller. In conclusion, IA and its member companies share the subcommittee's goal of promoting consumer health and safety, which is why our members have created a range of tools and programs to help brands police the misuse of their marks and work productively with law enforcement agents who prosecute intellectual property crimes. The internet industry understands that counterfeiting is a significant global problem, and we will continue to engage with this subcommittee to confront existing and emerging challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baroya. Ms. Reed, the time is now yours. You may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Issa, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today concerning the challenges that brand owners currently face under the current legal framework when holding third-party sellers liable for counterfeiting products on e-commerce marketplaces, and how the best practices set forth in the Shop Safe Act will actually help to protect against these issues. My name is Natasha Reed, and I'm a partner at the law firm Foley Hoag. I have the privilege of representing both large and small businesses in a variety of fields in connection with trademark and copyright enforcement, brand protection, and anti-counterfeiting litigation. These companies invest a substantial amount of time and resources into building consumer confidence in the safety and quality of their products associated with their brands, but they encounter counterfeit versions of their products sometimes on a daily basis on various e-commerce marketplaces. Counterfeits thrive on e-commerce marketplaces in particular for a variety of reasons, including the relatively low barrier to establish an online storefront, and the fact that these marketplaces give the sellers an air of legitimacy, and because sellers can often operate anonymously under aliases, fake names, and even stolen identities. Brand owners will often utilize the reporting mechanisms offered by the marketplaces as an initial enforcement action to stop the counterfeiters by filing takedown complaints, but it's not uncommon for these sellers to be taken down by the marketplaces, only to pop up again under a different storefront name on the same marketplace or transfer to a different marketplace. The counterfeiters will also often operate multiple storefront accounts at the same time on the same marketplace, using aliases, different mailing addresses, and different financial accounts, so that one of its storefronts, when it's taken down for counterfeiting, it will already have another backup storefront ready to continue its counterfeit sales. This leads to a never-ending game of whack-a-mole for brand owners who are forced to file takedown requests day after day, often against some of the same sellers. Some brand owners will decide to bring a court action against these counterfeit sellers, but these cases often present procedural issues. First, without an accurate name and address, brand owners are often forced to file John Doe actions against these sellers, and they will need to seek early and expedited discovery by issuing subpoenas to force the online marketplaces to produce information about the sellers' identities and their financial accounts. But as noted earlier, counterfeiters often provide these marketplaces with false names and false contact information. So this leaves the brand owners with the burden of trying to verify their identities. And it makes it very difficult to freeze these counterfeiters' assets when the names don't match the financial accounts. The use of false addresses also makes it virtually impossible to, particularly for online counterfeiters, to serve these defendants with process, unless the court allows the brand owners to serve by email or by some alternate means. Establishing personal jurisdiction against the third-party marketplace sellers can also present challenges. Courts often question whether these defendants use the online marketplaces to reach the forum in a meaningful way or purposeful way, since it is the online marketplaces and not the sellers themselves that actually control the interactivity of the websites. And even if favorable judgments are obtained in the lawsuit, including a permanent injunction and monetary damages, counterfeiters, especially those overseas, often ignore them, popping up on marketplaces, again, under different names, and moving any assets that they may have had in the US overseas. And this presents challenges because it's very difficult to enforce these judgments overseas, especially if the seller's identity has not been verified. I believe many of the best practices in the Shop Safe Act will help to address these challenges. However, the current scope of the act is limited only to goods that would implicate health and safety. And while arguably most counterfeit goods would implicate health and safety if they're not manufactured based on the brand owner's quality controls and policies, I believe determining whether certain products qualify may be difficult for marketplaces, and there will be gray areas that could expose the marketplaces to liability if they make the wrong determination. Also, having two separate best practice standards in place for the marketplaces for certain goods but not others will cause confusion. And so for that reason, I would recommend broadening the scope of the products covered under the Shop Safe Act to include all goods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reed, and we will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Simpson, your written testimony includes some staggering figures about the money and resources that your member companies expend to combat counterfeits. You mentioned, for example, that a single personal care products company can spend up to $15 million a year on combating counterfeits. You also noted that one of your member companies has 10 outside firms managing its notice and takedown processes. Now that's remarkable. Your testimony also references the critical role that small businesses play in the personal care products industry. Can you give us any additional details about how these smaller businesses manage the online counterfeiting problem and what particular hurdles they face?
Absolutely. I think, counterfeit personal care products are fraud. They damage businesses, they're a drain on the economy, and most importantly, threaten consumers' health and safety. According to a report from the OECD, the cosmetics industry loses more money to counterfeiters than any other industry, $5.4 billion annually. Small businesses make up 2/3 of the personal care product sector. Small personal care companies often don't have the resources to employ brand protection efforts. The best practices outlined in this legislation would help prevent counterfeits from ever being offered for sale and set in place a process for removal of counterfeit listings and infringing sellers, therefore protecting small companies' brands and their consumers from potentially harmful counterfeits.
Thank you. In what ways do you see the best practices that are outlined in the Shop Safe Act easing the burden for your members and other brand owners?
We think paramount is the verification of these third-party sellers. Also, the screening efforts in place, I think really these proactive measures would go a long way. But also, if there are counterfeits listing, having clear processes in place for takedowns to address repeat infringers and terminations of those accounts, we think would go a long way in preventing counterfeits from ever getting into the hands of consumers.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Reed, you have extensive experience on the front lines of brand enforcement and in litigating counterfeiting and trademark infringement cases. You've testified about the challenges your clients have experienced in trying to identify and pursue claims directly against third parties. Do you, and if so, how do you see the best practices in the Shop Safe Act helping to address those challenges?
In a variety of ways. First of all, I think the verification requirement will go a long way. One of the issues that I addressed in my full testimony is that brand owners often have the burden of verifying these sellers after they have filed lawsuits, John Doe lawsuits, and then subpoenaed the online marketplaces for the actual names and addresses of these sellers, only to learn that some of these names are completely false and addresses are completely false, which leads to a very lengthy process of trying to actually locate these sellers. Oftentimes, we never do, and they get away with counterfeiting, and they know this. They operate almost as if they're untouchable, and this is why the counterfeits are able to proliferate. In addition to verification, also requiring that the sellers have an agent for service of process in the United States or have a US location or address will also go a long way. Again, as I mentioned, it's very difficult sometimes to serve these individuals with the process. Obviously, if we don't have a real address, we cannot serve them. So that will absolutely go a long way as well. Other provisions in the Shop Safe Act that I think will be helpful in litigating these cases include, or not just even litigating, just brand protection on a daily basis, include the proactive measures that that marketplaces will need to take in order to ensure that these counterfeits don't ever make their way on the marketplaces. The whack-a-mole game is also very expensive. Many small businesses cannot afford to have brand protection agents or multiple agents, monitoring the websites and then filing numerous takedowns day after day against some of the same sellers. So I think that will also go a long way as well.
All right, thank you. I'll yield the remainder of my time. And we'll next call upon the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to pick up where the chairman left off. Ms. Reed, I'm going to take advantage of your legal practice and go through a couple of quick questions. Earlier, I was showing real and fake medicines, but let me just go through a real example that most people haven't seen. So this is a skateboard, and that is a registered trademark and actually a facsimile of a piece of artwork. This was sold at JCPenney some years ago. Filed a suit against JCPenney because, of course, it was trademark infringement and copyright. They had a choice of paying countless hundreds of thousands of dollars or quickly settling. They settled. If today we were to have the same product, let's say one's being sold at Walmart and the other's being sold at Walmart.com, would it be fair to say that you could sue Walmart, but you couldn't sue Walmart.com because they would say it's somebody else's product, we're simply passing it through?
It is fair to say that if you're buying the product, or if the brand owner obviously has confirmed that it's counterfeit on a marketplace, and the actual seller is not considered the marketplace, but instead a third-party seller, it would be very difficult to hold that marketplace liable.
Right. And so many of the marketplaces would say that they don't know the product, but isn't it true that some of the largest warehouses, larger than even Walmart's warehouses, are owned by Amazon, that in fact, countless hundreds of millions of products go in and out of their warehouses every day for fulfillment, including probably more than half of all the beauty and healthcare products actually are fulfilled through Amazon, and currently you would not be able to sue them without this legislation.
That is accurate, yes. Many of these marketplaces, and Amazon in particular, operate and maintain large warehouses where they store these products for third-party sellers and move these products and ship them directly to the consumers.
Now, Mr. Barroyo, you sort of get the less than envious opportunity to sort of pick up from there. We've worked with all of your members. Almost all of them have had their general counsels on the phone with us. And today you basically said the standard was vague. This reasonableness had ambiguity, but many of those changes that are in the current law or the current bill are the result of that negotiation. So I'm going to follow back on, if you don't like this bill as it is, and if Ms. Reed is correct that in fact, a brick and mortar facility that passes through a product is suable, well, currently many of your members pass through, have in their warehouses, logistically assist in the product coming in and out, know its country of origin, but currently are allowed to take a blind eye to these counterfeits, even if notified. What would you have us do? And if you could be brief and just tell us what it is that caused us to negotiate only to find ourselves with no support from the companies in a way in which we could do this without essentially you're saying, no, we can't do it.
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Issa. I'll do my best to be brief, but forgive me if I stretch it a little bit because I want to be thorough as well.
Well, but I'll narrow the question. This question of, let's just say Amazon product comes in and out of their warehouse, and currently they get to treat it like they've never seen it when in fact they logistically manage it. If we limited the legislation only to a possession passing through, would that cure it for you, or would you still object based on the fact that you don't take ownership perhaps?
Well, I would have to refer a specific question about how one of my member companies would handle a particular scenario to one of my member companies, and I would be happy to ask the appropriate representative.
Let's do that. I've got one last question, which is for Ms. Carmel, actually for both of the first witnesses. Currently, we are limited to health and safety, and currently we don't have an antitrust exemption for companies working together. In your suggestions, would you say that those are two critical items, potentially lifting the health and safety, making it more uniform, and the second one, and probably the bigger one, an antitrust exemption allowing companies to essentially share information so that they could be more proactive in fighting these counterfeits?
And the time has expired, so please be brief with your answers.
Thank you for the question. I do believe it is essential to harmonize the type of goods to include any good under that. I think without that, it's going to make it more onerous, both for the brands and for the e-commerce platforms, but also create two goods under the Lanham Act and actually drive counterfeiting to different industries if there's more attention paid to one or the other. And I'm not one to speak on issues of antitrust. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we will turn to the gentleman from New York, the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin with my questions, I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony today. Mr. Barroyo, I understand that generally speaking, many marketplace platforms are taking the position that ShopSafe is unnecessary because in their view, their voluntary measures are sufficient to combat the counterfeiting problem on their websites. Some have gone even further and suggested that ShopSafe will undermine voluntary practices because platforms will be disincentivized to go beyond the practices set out in the bill. I find both positions hard to square with the reality that we continue to see and hear reports of dangerous counterfeit products being sold by third-party sellers on those sites. In the current landscape, how can consumers and brand owners be assured that the platforms are applying their brand protection and counterfeiting policies uniformly?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Nadler. Our member companies are using industry best practices to work with brand holders, collaborate with them, and rely on those brand holders' expertise in order to identify infringing products. There are somewhere between 2 and 3 million trademarks actively in use in the United States alone. And one of the big challenges here is that the onus in this bill would shift from trademark owners who have expertise and can identify and differentiate between genuine and fake products to online platforms that have zero expertise in doing that type of work. But nevertheless, our companies are committed to doing work. In some cases, our companies have created training programs for law enforcement. They've worked to create different programs to flag infringing products. And our goal as an industry is to remove these products that are dangerous to consumers before consumers are harmed. We don't want to wait until after somebody is harmed and worry about liability. We want to work collaboratively with brands to remove these things before they are in the full stream of commerce or pull them out of the stream of commerce when they are identified as counterfeit.
And can you explain how setting a level playing field that requires minimum best practices would discourage platforms from doing more as they currently claim they are?
I'm sorry, Chairman, would you mind repeating that question? I didn't quite understand that.
Can you explain how setting a level playing field that requires minimum best practices would discourage platforms from doing more as they currently claim they are?
Well, Chairman, the practices that are used differ from platform to platform. These platforms aren't sort of a single approach to providing services to sellers or buyers. So they have to be a little bit different in how they handle things, and they're working with brand owners. This is an evolutionary process. You've got counterfeiters who are constantly, it's not just whack-a-mole, this is cat and mouse. And I'm somebody who has spent nearly a decade enforcing IP online myself. It is incredibly challenging, and it requires collaboration and commitment on the part of all stakeholders, including law enforcement, to work with one another and try and identify these bad actors who are in this space. But they are a small minority. And while they are a small minority, they're nevertheless very important to identify and deal with before consumers are feeling the harm is caused.
Thank you. Ms. Campbell, I have a related question for you. Based on your research and experience, do you share the concern that enacting the ShopSafe Act could be a step backward in the combating the counterfeit problem in online marketplaces, and why or why not?
Thank you for the question. No, I believe that it presents an actually uniform approach to what some platforms may already be doing in various capacities. But as has been mentioned, it's voluntary, so it's not always transparent, and it is not required by the law. So at any time, they could discontinue the practice if they wanted to. I do think the Act provides a baseline and guidance on some of these proactive as well as some reactive measures. But I also believe the language is open-ended to allow for an iterative process on behalf of the platforms to continue with their ongoing efforts or technological advances in their work. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Reed, you have testified about your significant experience in litigating counterfeiting cases. Can you talk about how your practice and your clients' experience with online counterfeits has changed over the course of your career? In particular, have there been any notable, more recent changes that you think might be relevant for our consideration of the issue of counterfeits sold by third-party sellers on marketplace platforms?
Thank you for the question. So my practice has changed over the 15 years that I've been handling these types of cases for obvious reasons, because counterfeits were offline previously and now they're online. And then they were on websites, now they're on marketplaces. I would say the most challenging part of the change relates to personal jurisdiction. When counterfeiters are selling on their own websites, it's a lot easier to establish jurisdiction because they actually control the websites. Whereas on online marketplaces, courts will sometimes find that there is no personal jurisdiction because the sellers did not necessarily ship products to the forum. And it becomes very difficult to prove that they did without subpoenaing the marketplaces, and it becomes a very expensive task to establish personal jurisdiction. So I think that's the biggest difference from moving from brick and mortar to websites and now to marketplaces.
Thank you. My time has expired, so I yield back.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, now, okay, sorry about that. I lost.
I'm sorry, and I was on mute. I do want to now extend this to you, the gentleman from Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought you were just messing with me there. So one of our most important responsibilities as elected representatives is to enact legislation that protects our constituents. And as the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, I've studied the immense threat that the PRC, China, poses to our country, whether it's opioids, particularly fentanyl, coming in to our country and killing just an untold number of Americans, efforts by the Chinese Communist Party to sabotage our democratic elections or steal our intellectual property or flood our online marketplaces with illegal and often dangerous counterfeit materials, as we're discussing here this afternoon. It seems that there's virtually nothing that they'll stop at that can harm our citizens and our businesses and our overall economy. While unscrupulous sellers continue to appear and reappear on our online marketplaces with counterfeit products that mostly originate in China, sites like Alibaba, one of the largest online marketplaces operating in China, seems to be able to keep those same counterfeit products off those sites. Now, American companies like Procter & Gamble, which happens to be headquartered in my district, as well as businesses all across the country, collectively lose huge amounts of money, as we've already talked about today, each year due to the presence of counterfeited and pirated products. This not only has a negative impact on our economy, but also introduces products into our communities, which can often be hazardous and sometimes deadly to American consumers. Ms. Simpson, let me begin with you if I can, and thank you and thank all of you for being with us today. I think your testimony's been great, really. Given that we know that 80 to 90% of counterfeit products originate in China, could you discuss what we know about how closely, how aware the government is? I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, nothing happens substantially in China without the government knowing about it, if not being involved in it. Could you discuss that element? What role do you believe the government plays in what we're discussing here on the counterfeit products?
I'm not sure what role, are you talking about the Chinese government plays? But
I am.
I
Yes.
know that, according to the OECD report from 2019, the majority of fake goods, picked up in customs checks originate in mainland China and Hong Kong. I would say, the Shop Safe Act addresses country of origin, and platforms are required to display, information on the seller, location of where the product's shipping from and manufactured to consumers, in addition to contact information. So we are pleased to see, the legislation address that point, and think it would be helpful in preventing counterfeit products from getting into the hands of consumers.
Thank you. Would anyone of the other witnesses like to take a shot at that? Just how much do you believe the government there is aware of what's going on here? I'll take by the silence that none of the witnesses necessarily either wants to comment or can't comment on that. So I'll move on. Ms. Reed, let me ask you this. What are the main obstacles that American businesses face in trying to enforce their trademarks and block counterfeits from overseas, particularly from China?
Thank you for the question. There are many obstacles. I mean, the main obstacle I would say is because these counterfeits proliferate on online marketplaces and they can potentially be purchased by thousands, if not millions, of US consumers and global consumers, brand owners really have a difficult time in educating the consumers about counterfeits. They have a difficult time in actually holding those third-party sellers liable. If they're in China or other countries outside of the US, they often have assets that are not in the US, and it's difficult to actually hold them monetarily liable. And often that's really the only way to stop them is to take their money away. And when you can't do that, it becomes extremely difficult to disincentivize them to stop counterfeiting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you, sir. I will next turn to the gentleman from California, Mr. Ted Lieu, for 5 minutes. You're recognized, Mr. Lieu.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Issa for holding this important hearing. I have a question for Ms. Simpson. I'm curious for personal care products and for your member companies, on average, how long does it take you to figure out that a product is being counterfeited?
That's a great question. I think our member companies work very closely with the platforms and are constantly monitoring, social media sites, monitoring the platforms and working to identify, what could be potential counterfeits, and work directly with them on the, notice and takedown process, which I mentioned earlier, which can vary from platform to platform. So as soon as they, see potential infringing content, they will file that notice and takedown with the individual platform, which, the various requirements could vary from platform to platform. And then it will get turned over to a brand protection team there. And then it determines whether or not they remove the infringing listing. So that's the general process.
In your experience, when they do this notice and takedown, or their online platforms, are they generally responsive? Are we talking about a day? Are we talking about 5 weeks? So what are we talking about here?
That's a great question. Sometimes it's immediate, but I've heard from our member companies, it could even take several months and even involve a back and forth with the sellers or with the platforms. And the number of notice and takedowns really only increasing. From one of our member companies from 2019 to 2020 saw over a 211% increase in their notice and takedowns. Over 110,000 of those in the US alone, and a third of those from social media sites.
Great, thank you. Mr. Barroya, I have a question for you. So can you tell us what is it that your online platforms do to verify a seller before they can start selling?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Lieu. It really depends from platform to platform, but all platforms do some level, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to register as a seller.
Tell me about the platform that does the least. What do they do?
I couldn't tell you what platform does the least.
If you could provide that information to the committee, that'd be great. I'd be interested in knowing what is the minimum needed for a seller to just start selling stuff to American people on one of the internet platforms.
We'll do our best to pull that information together for you, Congressman Lieu. I guess on that point, though, if you would permit, I think one of the big challenges with this bill is the verification aspect of it. We're talking about professional counterfeiters, and the idea somehow is that online platforms will have an ability to verify credentials that they never touch and handle to confirm the identities and physical locations of individuals who are selling goods virtually. These are counterfeiters. They have the ability to get access to counterfeit identification. And without being able to look at a hologram on an ID or even having expertise in the verification of an ID, it is difficult for me personally to understand how that process is going to result in the value proposition of this bill, which is an important one, which is protecting consumers before they are harmed by these problematic products.
Let me sort of I'm just trying to understand the issue. I'd like to follow up with what Ranking Member Issa said. Let's say Walmart sells a counterfeit item. My understanding is that Walmart can get sued. If Walmart.com sells the exact same counterfeit item, they cannot get sued. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is my understanding as well.
Okay. Do you see a problem with that?
That Walmart and Walmart.com can be sued? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Yeah, because isn't really the only difference that Walmart, maybe they have like an additional store clerk that might, place the item on the shelf, and maybe someone in inventory that takes the item out of a box and gives it to that store clerk. But it's not clear to me why Walmart brick and mortar has any more knowledge of this counterfeit item than Walmart.com would.
Right, but I think as compared to the platforms that I represent, the difference could be that the platform itself never has physical possession of the product. They can't independently verify, nor do they have specific knowledge about the characteristics of the underlying IP. Again, there's 2 to 3 million trademarks in use in the United States alone. That's just US trademarks. There is no way any single platform would be able to have the requisite knowledge. In some cases, it comes down to the quality of thread used for stitching. That is the difference between the types of products that Ranking Member Issa was demonstrating at the beginning of his opening statement that are legitimate versus the ones that are fake. And there is no specialized knowledge on the part of these platforms. That specialized knowledge resides with the trademark holders, which is why it's so important that online platforms collaborate with them to understand how to identify these products and take them out of the stream of commerce before anyone is harmed.
Thank you. My time is up and I yield back.
Thank you. If the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomet, chooses to invoke his video, he will be recognized for 5 minutes. The gentleman from Texas, my friend, Judge Gomet.
Okay, thank you very much, and appreciate everybody's input. On a trip some years back that some members of Congress made to China, our group met with a top Chinese government bureaucrat that assured us that the Chinese government took violations of patent, copyright, trademark very seriously. A couple of us met privately with another bureaucrat who was very nice. And he said, yeah, they could probably do more. That's an understatement, of course. But they had had over 500 arrests of violations of patent, copyright, trademark, and that they had seized so much illegal material. And when asked, well, what did you do with all those illegal products? He said, well, he believed that it's against Chinese law to just dispose of things that had value, so they were probably sold. We're not getting a lot of help out of the Chinese government. They're taking us to the cleaner so many different ways. But to your knowledge, and this is to any of our witnesses, what is the Biden administration doing to enforce our current patent, trademark, copyright laws with China? Wow.
Was that directed at any particular witness?
No,
Judge
just anybody that might have had an answer. If you know what's being done, and apparently, as we used to say, picking juries, I take it from your silence, you don't know of anything. So, uh, well, and one of the things that we've dealt with in the overall Judiciary Committee and in prior sessions, it's been a important bicameral and bipartisan issue trying to reform our criminal laws. We supposedly have over 5,000, and nobody really knows, and they hadn't been put together. They're not all in 18 USC. So I get a little reluctant to pass laws we may not need if we enforce existing law. Um, so if you're aware of any websites that are truly successful in keeping counterfeit products off their websites, uh, then is that something that we could use existing law to require more thoroughly? What is there, are there any solutions besides new legislation? And again, that's to anyone on any one of the panel of witnesses. Well,
Representative Gomer, this is John Baroya.
John.
Let me take a stab at that one. So best practices in this space are constantly evolving. And I think one of the things that is helpful for the subcommittee to understand is exactly that. My member companies are on day after day, month after month, year after year, trying to improve the types of solutions and tools that they make available to brand owners in order to remove access to infringing products. I don't know that anybody's doing it perfectly, and I can't remember which one of the members who gave an opening statement, but acknowledged that it's impossible to aim for perfect, essentially, because that's a boiling the ocean kind of approach. I think one of the things, to your point about concerns with the international source of counterfeiting, however, is the Department of Justice has a lot of very strong programs that are used to identify infringement, work with foreign governments, and then bring the manufacturers of infringing products to justice, including the intellectual property law enforcement coordinators, the computer crime and intellectual property section within the Department of Justice, and within U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, you've got the National IPR Center. I think any work that this subcommittee or Congress generally could do to increase resources to those and other entities within the federal government that are tasked with identifying and prosecuting trademark crime and IP crime generally would be things that every member of this panel would support. And I don't mean to speak for others, but certainly our industry would 100% support that.
I see my time's expired. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge Gomer. It's now my pleasure to recognize the distinguished gentleman from New York and the co-chair of the Subcommittee on Courts, Intellectual Property, and the Internet, Mr. Mondaire Jones, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for your leadership, Mr. Chairman. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in what is a bipartisan hearing on protecting the health and safety of our constituents from counterfeit products sold online. I thank our witnesses for their testimony today, and I especially thank Chairman Nadler and Chairman Johnson, of course, for reintroducing the Shop Safe Act this Congress. As the COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated, millions of us turn to online retailers for products that affect our health and safety, from masks to medications. When we shop online for these necessities, the stakes are as high as it gets. The difference between real and counterfeit medicine, for example, can be the difference between life and death. Everyone should be able to shop online for what they need to stay healthy, in confidence that they are getting what they have paid for. So I'm glad to see this bill make that our top priority. I have a question for all of the witnesses. In your written testimony, each of you has suggested that the bill's definition of goods that implicate health and safety may be too vague. If the committee wants to focus on health and safety, how would you suggest defining that phrase? What kinds of goods should the bill reach? Ms. Simpson, let's start with you.
Sure. From our perspective, All counterfeits are fraud. They all cause harm and have potential to be dangerous. Efforts to distinguish between those that could cause health and safety risks and those that may not could be confusing for consumers and cause potential impediments to effective implementation. So we want to see, legislation here that really does, address this issue of counterfeits and works in practice. And we look forward to continuing to work with the committee on that.
Okay. Mr. Baroya?
Thank you for the question, Representative Jones. I'll be honest, I don't envy the committee. This is difficult work. It is very difficult to tightly define something so that it covers just the types of products that you want to cover for all of the reasons that other panelists acknowledged. Health and safety can touch almost any product, and where the edges of that are very blurry lines. But we'd be happy to continue our engagement with the subcommittee and with the sponsors of the bill as discussions move forward to try and hem in or sort of cordon off the specific types of products that you're most concerned about.
I'm hoping someone will be more specific. Ms. Camel, would you please give it a try?
Thanks for the question. So from my perspective, I think it should cover all types of counterfeit marks and not be limited to it. But if it is limited to health and safety, that it should be health and safety of any good, genuine, or counterfeit. So as we know from a lot of industries or even product lines that might not on their face look like they implicate health and safety, we hear lots of stories from brand owners about what happens when they actually purchase a counterfeit of a product that upon first glance we might think implicates health and safety, but lots of testing has been done by brand owners, everything from toxicity to safety testing on the counterfeits. And it shows that a lot of these products can actually harm the consumer. So to differentiate it, it should include, if that language is going to stay in from my perspective, that it would include health and safety concerns for either genuine or counterfeit products. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Reed?
Yes, I agree with Ms. Camel. I do see improvement as it relates to the limitation on products that implicate health and safety, particularly because it forces the marketplaces to make that determination. And for all intents and purposes, it would hold them liable if they get it wrong. I believe virtually all counterfeits implicate health and safety because they're not being made under the same quality controls as the brand owner's quality controls. Counterfeiters are just not going to do that. They're not going to test products. So for an example, an apparel company may test its garments to ensure that the materials used aren't harmful. Counterfeiters won't do that. And the marketplace would have to make the determination about whether apparel would be the type of product that could be harmful. So I see that as a gray area, and I would hope that there is a consideration to expanding the meaning to all products.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We next turn to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, and also the winner of today's most scenic backdrop. We recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. That's my farm back there. Are there things to like about this bill that seem kind of common sense? Maybe a third-party seller should have to list an address. I like the fact that the country of origin label for things would be listed. But I think this bill may have problems that the other bills in this same category have, which the category is bills that try to solve crimes before they happen, or bills that assume that everybody who's doing business is doing it unscrupulously until they can prove that they are scrupulous. Mr. Baroya, I want to address you with most of my questions, but generally, I want to cover some issues or talk about some issues that I'm concerned about in this bill. One is, will this bill solve the problem that we're trying to solve? I mean, any legislation, that should be the first question. Does it solve the problem? I would think that providing a fake government ID or a fake address would be the easiest thing a counterfeiter has ever done. That's probably a warm-up exercise for most counterfeiters who are trying to design printed circuit boards or the fabrics and have them manufactured. So I'm not sure that putting that onus on the platforms is going to solve the problem. The other thing is, will this cause other problems? Is the scope too broad? Do we understand how broad the scope is? For instance, if somebody's selling a device that has a Bluetooth symbol on it, and they haven't submitted it to the Bluetooth special interest group for certification, are they a counterfeiter? Because that would probably make 90% of Bluetooth products out there counterfeits right now. So that's how broad is this? What doesn't touch health or safety? Is everything that's got an underwriter's laboratory symbol affixed to it, is that health and safety? Are the tractor parts that I'm going to buy online to work on this farm, are those covered under it? And that gets me to another thing. Why is there even a small business exemption in here? It's at $500,000. If you were making 10% profit as a platform, you would make $50,000 a year. You would have you wouldn't even be able to pay for one employee and have benefits and make the minimum wage for your one single employee. And furthermore, the small business exemption has a problem in that it says it goes away if you've been served notice 10 times. Well, if you've been served notice 10 times, as I understand it, you're already covered under the existing law. You could already be liable for selling counterfeit goods. So anyways, I just wonder, is this bill going to be applied equally? Do we understand how broadly it's going to be applied? Why don't we have a real small business exemption that can cover a small profitable business instead of a small hobby exemption, which is what this is, and it's not even really an exemption. So I just want to lay those thoughts out there and ask you, Mr. Baroya, if you could speak to any of them.
Sure. So there was a lot there, and I don't disagree with any of your assessments, Representative Massey. In terms of, will this bill solve the problem of counterfeit goods that are injuring and harming consumers? I don't believe that it will. It is very broad. It is massively broad in a variety of different ways, including the definition of electronic commerce platforms themselves. That definition is so broad that it can include email service providers. And I don't know how email service providers would go about doing some of the best practices that are identified in the list. But furthermore, I can't help but agree with the point that you made that the verification process is something that I think sophisticated counterfeiters are going to easily overcome. And that will not stop them from putting harmful products out there. What will solve this problem, and it's an iterative process, it requires a lot of collaboration, is anything that puts more resources in the hands of law enforcement, anything that encourages further collaboration, and there's a lot of collaboration going on already, but further collaboration between online platforms, traditional retailers, and brands. Because it is the brands who understand what is and is not infringing. They have specific knowledge. They can identify and they can let both retailers and online platforms know how to identify these products. They can share URLs and say, this is infringing. They can say, this is the text of a template that it appears this individual is using on 5 different websites. Can we use this to kind of initiate a takedown process or work with you to identify these bad actors? So all of those things need to happen. They are happening. They need to continue to happen.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Next, we will turn to the distinguished gentlewoman from the great state of North Carolina, Congresswoman Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, and it's great to see you twice virtually in a day. We've been very active on the Judiciary Committee today. And thank you very much to the witnesses for testifying. Like my colleagues, I'm deeply concerned about the proliferation of counterfeit goods. The perpetrators of the counterfeiting crime really commit 2 crimes. They steal from innovators and then they endanger consumers. And so I see this as a 2-pronged problem. In my home state of North Carolina, authorities have seized counterfeit goods ranging from clothing to medicine and even to airbags. Counterfeiting is not a victimless crime. Unknowing consumers put themselves and their families at significant risk, and our economy suffers when intellectual property is stolen. legitimate businesses lose sales, and governments lose tax revenue. I represent the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, where a number of pharmaceuticals are tested and made, and where we have personal care products. We're the home to Virtue Labs. I don't know if you know about Virtue Labs, but fantastic products. And so my first question is for Ms. Simpson. Your members' personal care products are sold in brick and mortar stores as well as online. What types of issues have your members seen arise in counterfeit versions of the products? Can you discuss the stringent safety and quality standards your members' products have to meet to be sold in the brick and mortar stores, and how those differ from what online platforms currently require?
Absolutely. Cosmetics and personal care products are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires that every product and its individual ingredients are safe before they're put on the market, and cosmetics companies have a legal responsibility to ensure that products are safe and properly labeled, and current federal law provides for penalties for failure to meet these requirements. Our member companies take their responsibility to make safe products very seriously. Consumer and product safety are top priorities for our industry, with careful scientific research and development serving as the foundation for everything we do. The U.S. cosmetics industry invests nearly $3 billion annually in scientific research and development. I would say in terms of counterfeit products, inherently they pose health risks to consumers since they're produced illegally without adherence to federal or state safety and quality requirements. Counterfeit products could be adulterated, they could be tampered with, they could be expired, they could contain materials not of cosmetic grade, meaning consumers could be applying adulterated or impure products directly to the skin, lips, eyes, and other sensitive areas, including products indicated for children's use. A 2020 Department of Homeland Security report noted that counterfeit cosmetics often contain elements such as arsenic, mercury, and aluminum, and that counterfeit personal care items have been found contaminated with substances from harmful bacteria to human waste.
Thank you very much. My next question has to do with some of the transparency in the Shop Safe Act that would ensure consumers and brand owners have accurate information available to them. Things like listing who the seller is, where they're located, where you can contact them, where the products are shipped from. Ms. Reed, how would having this information aid your members and clients? And are there certain red flags that consumer brands would be able to point to if they got this information?
Thank you for the question. This information would aid my clients in a number of ways. Usually when my clients come to me, it's either because they've already confirmed counterfeits, they've done their own takedowns through brand protection agents, and the takedowns have not been successful, meaning they were taken down, but they popped up again, and my clients want to litigate. Having verified names and addresses would help us investigate. So we would likely, commence a full-blown investigation prior to filing a lawsuit. It would help us in, and it might include, visiting the locations where these counterfeiters might be, because they might actually be the source of the counterfeits. I mean, they might be manufacturing, which would be highly relevant for my clients. Requiring that the sellers have an agent for service of process would make the process of serving these individuals a lot easier. And ultimately, I believe the transparency and being able to verify and then know that the contact and names are accurate would give clients confidence that they can successfully litigate against these individuals without facing motions to dismiss for lack of jurisdiction and other procedural issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And today we are favored to have not just one, but two distinguished people from North Carolina, Congress people. Next, I present to you the distinguished Mr. Dan Bishop for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess maybe I should note that not only did Congresswoman Ross and I graduate in the same class at the University of North Carolina Law School, we were in the same small section together. Who could have known, right, Deborah? But I'm going to offer to yield my time to the ranking member, Mr. Ison. Did you have an additional question? Look, Daryl's coming along. Give him a second to react if you'd like to ask additional
I'm in
questions.
shock. I'm in shock. Thank you. Thank the gentleman for yielding. Let me go through a couple of things because I want to make sure we characterize the legislation in an appropriate way. I think I'll actually ask it this way. Is there anyone here that thinks that the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is a failure, overly burdensome, or in some other way has done nothing to deal with counterfeits of music and the like on the internet? Hearing none, would basically let's use Ms. Simpson. Would you contrast this bill with the DMCA? DMCA requiring notice and takedown, and it's worked for, if you will, intangibles versus these tangible items?
I can't speak to specifics of the DMCA, but just aware of the current system that we're working on for counterfeits right now, and that our members are facing for notice and takedowns, and just would say that currently that system, isn't working. They're unable to keep up and get this verified information.
Right, but DMCA, has worked fairly well for music. Mr. Baroya, would you say that your members, they deal with that every day? Amazon is probably one of the largest music providers. Have they been able to verify the legitimacy of the what they sell online?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Issa. I can't speak to Amazon's specific experience, but as somebody who's been a practitioner of IP enforcement for almost a decade, I can tell you that the DMCA works, but there's also stark differences between the legislative regime that was created by the DMCA and what is here. For example, notice and takedown in the DMCA requires the rights holder to identify infringement. In the Shop Safe Act, it's the opposite. The burden is.
Let's go through that. Under this act, there's a requirement. It's basically 3 strikes and you're out. If someone says something's a counterfeit, don't they have to show more than one event in order to even cause the takedown?
With due respect, Ranking Member Issa, the act also has provisions that require platforms to implement automated processes of essentially notice and stay down, which is something that was rejected by the Copyright Office within the last year when they were reviewing Section 512.
Well, let's go through that. Notice and stay down in this case is for a counterfeit tangible good, correct?
It would be, but it also assumes that the online platform is capable of identifying something as counterfeit. So the difference between enforcing for Scott paper products, and Scott bicycles is a
Well,
huge
let's go through. I think, and I'm using the gentleman's time. I want to use it wisely. You said that it's burdensome to deal with the origin, in other words, the authenticity of the vendor, and you talked about seeing his identification, and we wouldn't be able to, after all, they're counterfeiters. Isn't it almost universally true that your members, in fact, collect the money or participate in the money and ensure that they get their share of it, either because they collect it and pass the remainder on to the source, or they have to guarantee that they're going to get what they're entitled to from that source? So let me just ask a simple question, just as a plain old country businessman. If they can verify the source well enough to make sure they get paid dollars, millions of dollars, whatever amount, why is it that it's so difficult to verify the source for purposes of who they are?
Well, Representative, I say one doesn't need to have the name, the address, and be able to verify that those things are exactly true in order to make a one-to-one connection between one bank account and another bank account.
Well, let's go to Ms. Reed. When you're trying to find an entity, and he's already said, basically he's okay knowing that they have a U.S. bank account. Is that a significant step that you would see in this legislation that these companies already have, which is they're holding money, they're transferring money to an entity, and under international law and US law, they have to verify that entity for purposes of fraud is a real entity, don't they?
And Mr. Bishop, your time has expired, but
Thank
we
you,
won't
Mr.
hold
Bishop.
it against you. Will the witness please answer the question succinctly?
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. Yes, in terms of, the marketplaces having access to receive payment and to make payments, my understanding is that, and these payments are usually either with payment service providers or banks, is that ultimately these payments, there's a third party involved, there's an intermediary, there's a financial institution who likely has some information that would verify the identity of the sellers. In fact, when I litigate these cases and I subpoena the marketplaces, they provide the bank financial details. I then subpoena the banks and then I get the actual names. That's how we sometimes get to the actual identity. So it is possible to know who these people are because they want to get paid. The counterfeiters want to get paid, and they have to pay also Amazon or eBay or whoever it is that they're doing business with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now have the opportunity to view the backdrop of the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, should he choose to show it. And he will not be able to compete with Mr. Massey on the backdrop, unfortunately. But you're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And having not had the opportunity to participate in these discussions over the last year, I fear my questions would be an embarrassment, particularly to me. But that gives me an opportunity to yield to Ranking Member Issa yet again, since it seems like he wasn't quite yet done.
Well, let's follow. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Ms. Reed, let's go through that again. You've got a history of litigation. If, let's just use hypothetically eBay and Amazon, just as straw companies, if they must have the financial information and they have it, if they know the banks, and if they, quite frankly, these intermediaries, they work with them thousands or tens of thousands of times. If this legislation were passed, wouldn't it be relatively simple for them to ensure that this one more step in the law, which is a domestic service point, were added? Would it be burdensome to those companies? We'll get to small companies later, but to those companies, do you see anything burdensome there?
In terms of the
process of service.
Yeah, I don't see that being burdensome at all. I mean, I actually see that as being one of the easiest things to, require the businesses, the sellers to do, and for the sellers to actually implement it.
And, it was suggested to us during the markup of, or pre-markup of this legislation that they could even potentially, we could include in the law a recognition that they would accept service by email. We didn't put it into the law because there were some questions about whether or not that would be sufficient in the courts, and we're checking it. But from a standpoint of if a company wants to do business in the United States, asking them to have some place that they would accept service would seem to be the source. But let me go back. Let's just say we don't have that service. And, if you will, these major carriers tell us that they can't get it. Isn't the real meat of this bill the question of whether or not they take down the infringer in a timely fashion? So even if that wasn't in the bill, isn't the real meat the fact that this, for the first time, says if you don't cooperate when you're being informed about counterfeits 3 times or 10 times, depending upon the size of the company, that you can take liability? Isn't that really what we're discussing here today?
Is that question for me?
Yes, as a litigator.
I I think that, yes, I think the contributory liability portion is the meat and bones of the legislation. Yes, I agree.
And so briefly, on behalf of all of them, anyone I'll let take it, if in fact what we're doing is trying to have this for those who don't, and then create a safe harbor, are any of you want to ask the question of why is it we've had a very difficult time with these online platforms defining the safe harbor they would like, rather than simply telling us that they don't like whatever we legislate? If you, Ms. Reed, I'm going to go back to you again. You've been a very good witness. Would you say that you could write the safe harbor as well or better, and simply these companies are choosing to say they don't want a safe harbor, they just don't want the legislation?
Well, I don't know if I would characterize it that way. And I do believe that the marketplaces have similar goals, and that they want to get these counterfeits off of their platforms. And I know that there are marketplaces that are doing, proactively are doing things. I do think that ultimately the issue is whether they want it to be voluntary or required, and that's really the issue.
Well, and as a litigator, when we put in this bill, this legislation, 14 times the word reasonable, I know that is considered vague, but isn't every one of those an impediment to your litigation, in that we have made this a piece of legislation that is not easy to overcome? You'll have to show repeatedly that people were unreasonable if this legislation becomes law.
That's right. I mean, there is a standard, and the standard has to be argued in a court of law in terms of whether the marketplaces acted reasonably or not. So that is accurate.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's hearing. Unless there's someone on the Zoom call that I'm not recognizing that needs to be recognized, speak now or forever hold your peace. So, assuming that there is none, we are at the bottom of the hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, thank the members of the subcommittee for their attendance today. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And with that, and with no gavel, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.